I'm very pleased to introduce Antoaneta Dimitrova, who is a professor for comparative governance at Leiden University. So thank you for joining us today. She's been extensively researching on the question of transformation as a result and governance transfer as a result of EU's integration processes towards Central and Eastern Europe. She's been working on the countries of Southeastern Europe as well as of the European neighborhood, where she's one of the coordinators of a Horizon 2020 project at the moment, as far as I know. And she's, though, going to talk to us today about some citizens' discourses about enlargement in Serbia and North Macedonia, and what that tells us about the larger dilemmas of EU integration. So Antoaneta, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and the floor is yours. And all of the students, as usual, please keep your microphones and cameras turned off. Afterwards, of course, you're very welcome to raise your questions and we'll have a discussion. You can use the raise your hand option, you can write in the chat, and then we can have hopefully a very good discussion. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Florian. Good morning, everyone, on this Monday morning. I'm happy to talk to you about some of our research and about the bigger themes of Europeanization from a critical perspective, the very nice topic of this course, which has been devised by your Professor Bieber. So let me just see how my PowerPoint moves. Yes, it does move. Good. Let me start with, let's see if I can minimize. Yeah, so I can see my own slides and you can see me. Let me start with a couple of words on the state of play in the European Union's seemingly endless process of enlargement with the Western Balkans. And after this very, very quick look at the state of play, I'm going to talk to you about the general conditions under which enlargement might or might not proceed, as in actual accession, and what is happening with Europeanization in between. And in particular, this part of Europeanization, since this course is about Europeanization, I'm sure there's many, many definitions of Europeanization that you're going to work with, in particular Europeanization in the sense of to what extent are citizens aware of EU norms, of EU rules being transferred, and what does citizen perception, citizen reaction to the enlargement process mean for the broader process? How does it compare to other citizens in Europe? And this I'll do on the basis of some research findings from one of our projects. So Europeanization and enlargement, let me start with that, are two different things. Enlargement is, of course, a formal process. There is all kinds of formal agreements between the countries of the Western Balkans or Southeastern Europe and the European Union. There is the state of play of negotiations, which you can see on the screen, but there is also what people are making of it. And most of this talk will be about what people make of it, but it is still, of course, the process still has its formal dimensions. One of which is the EU distinguishes between official candidates and aspirant states. And aspirant states are usually states which are not seen yet as ready to be a candidate, which is a way for the European Union to actually cut conditionality, its own conditionality, in very, very small chunks. So here on the left, and I'm sure you're all aware of it, so this will be very brief. On the left, you have the countries negotiating, which are, of course, Montenegro and Serbia. They started what is by now quite some time ago, and the reason for this is the negotiation so far is very much a formal affair with open and closing chapters. And Montenegro has opened quite a lot of chapters, but has provisionally closed only 3. Serbia has quite a few chapters open as well. As you can see, only 2 provisionally closed. Let's not forget Turkey, whose negotiations are frozen for a very good reason. And a couple of years back, there was even talk to stop Turkey altogether from negotiating. Nowadays, there is still a look at the process, but we have it here only to mention it that Turkey is officially a candidate. Then you have 2 countries which should have been negotiating, but are not because of a number of unfortunate developments. North Macedonia, which has had a positive opinion from the European Commission since 2009, but in the period 2009-2018, it was informally stopped from starting negotiations due to, first of all, the informal Greek veto, Greece disagreeing with the name Macedonia, and in some years also very, very negative political developments in North Macedonia itself. This period ended with a Prespa agreement and the amendment of the country's name to North Macedonia, where the Greek formal veto was withdrawn. The Council of Ministers and the Commission approved the start of negotiations in 2020, but then suddenly, pre-electorally, a very strange new informal veto came from Bulgaria in 2020, in the European Council in 2020. So even though North Macedonia and Albania both have positive opinions and approval from the Council of Ministers of the European Union, somewhere in a vacuum of nothingness, they haven't started negotiations yet. At the same time, change of government in Bulgaria might offer some kind of opening to this process. And then there is, of course, Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo, which are classified by the US aspirant states. So we see, as also in the text which you were reading, you see a kind of a mixed picture of countries which appear to be moving towards the EU on the left, but also very, very slowly, if at all, and countries which would like to move closer to the European Union. And if we look at the very, very latest developments in 2020, at the beginning of COVID pandemic, and the policy actions needed at the EU level overshadowed this big initiative opened by the European Union in 2020, when there was a big revision of the EU's enlargement methodology, which included, on the one hand, stronger political steering, gradual inclusion in the countries in the single market, the so-called reversibility. You can open chapters, you can also close chapters, we can reopen them. But the biggest thrust of the EU's initiative started by the Commission in 2020 is stronger focus on economic development, which was linked to the realization that all of this, those chapters, opening, closing, has become somewhat ritualistic, has become somewhat pointless, and is not necessarily pushing real reforms or Europeanization, if you like. And on the other hand, the countries are suffering economic stagnation and are not moving fast in resolving issues such as youth unemployment, which are also crucially problematic for a lot of the region. So the European Union launched in October 2020 a huge EU economic and investment plan for the Western Balkans, relatively big, focused at the time on recovery, green and digital transition, economic regional cooperation. A number of flagship projects were announced, which were about connectivity in the region, so road and rail, connecting the region in between itself, but also with other parts of the EU, internet, broadband, energy, green and digital growth and jobs, and creation of the Western Balkans Guarantee Facility. And this is October 2020, and how far this has progressed, I actually cannot tell you, but there is one reason to be pessimistic, and it's simply that a lot of earmarked funding from the European Union has gone to corona measures. And of course, this also means corona measures for the countries, corona funding for the countries in the region. So it's not clear what part of this program has actually started, given the pandemic that we're in. So the state of play, there is some push from the EU, there is problems with the negotiations, there is a country holding North Macedonia hostage. Things are not looking good at the top. At the same time, if you look at the economic dynamics of the region, and if you look at the economic dynamics of EU accession in general, there is every reason to push forward. And there is also another thing which you can see from this table, which is taken from a very good recent paper from the European Stability Initiative. Even for the countries moving the slowest economically in terms of their development, joining the EU has meant a huge jump in their GDP, a huge economic improvement. You can see here, Lithuania, this fantastic 44% increase of their GDP. Estonia with 41.6, Romania with 39.2, and so on and so forth. So there is every reason, if you compare the bottom of the table where some data is not available, but some is, if you look at North Macedonia and Serbia, for example, as reasonable forerunners in a number of ways economically, or just as examples, if you like, to expect that while they're now 36.2% of EU GDP total, this is EU 28, so with the UK, but okay, that's not a, that's just an artifact of how this data is compiled. You can see that there is quite a lot that can happen if the countries are coming closer to the EU, or if the countries are becoming more part of the single market, which is the point of this new arrangement. And the question is, do citizens care more about economic prospects, about jobs, about youth unemployment, or do they care about formal accession? In order to answer this, we're going to look at the discourses by citizens in a moment, but let's remind ourselves that for any kind of formal enlargement to actually proceed, to be finalized, you need, at the moment, a number of conditions to be in place. If you look on the left, on the side of the candidates, successive governments need to adopt and implement reforms. And the reason why, with this very first state of play I showed you, that countries have opened a lot of chapters but not closed them, is because in the assessment of the EU, neither Serbia or nor Montenegro have adopted and implemented reforms in fundamental areas of governance and the acquis. Resolution of bilateral conflicts, I've put this on the side of the candidates, but of course it's also the job of the EU member states, as we've seen the cases with North Macedonia and Bulgaria and Greece. Political parties and civil society need to be supporting enlargement as a project. And last but not least, citizens need to support accession. And on the right, you see that similar conditions need to be in place in the EU member states, except for reform, of course, in the EU. It's not such a big condition now as it was before the big Eastern enlargement, because the EU is a little bit more ready for accession. But the big issue here is citizens, and this is perhaps strange for those of you who've looked at the institutional dimensions of the enlargement process, because enlargement in most countries can proceed actually quite far without citizens approving. It's an intergovernmental process, a process of negotiation between governments and the EU institutions mediated by the Commission, but governments can do it and parliaments can approve it. So for a long time, it was the idea that almost doesn't matter what citizens think. But nowadays we know better. Enlargement is a politicized process, especially in the member states. And this is becoming more and more an issue, as in the EU member states, a number of parliaments which may not approve accession treaties. Citizens in the EU member states also need to support up to a point ratification of accession treaties. So in order to get a bit of an idea how this looks, I'm going to show you public opinion. I'm going to show you the narratives, the discourses, the stories of citizens in the region and a little bit of citizens abroad to see how is this going actually. And the work that I'm showing you came from the question, citizens are important, from the assumption citizens are important, and that citizens of all the new and candidate countries may understand the last enlargement differently, and therefore citizens in candidate states have a projection towards future enlargement in a specific way. Surveys and public opinion are taken by governments as a measure of what they can do or cannot do on enlargement, whereas discourses, stories, narratives, these are another way for us to understand in a more critical, but also in a more bottom-up perspective, how citizens are actually making sense of enlargement. If we look at the state of public opinion, there was a brief peak in 2004 agreeing with enlargement. Why this is important is because, again, we're working on the assumption that what citizens of the EU member states made of the previous enlargement will influence how they think about future enlargement with Serbia, North Macedonia, Montenegro, and so on and so forth. However, citizens agreed with enlargement, strengthened the EU up to 2008, but then differences began to emerge in approval between EU East and West. And since 2012, the net public opinion is negative towards enlargement. Among the countries most opposed, you're in Graz, are Austria, Germany, France, and the Netherlands, very important countries, and even the veto of one of them can stop future enlargement, or can stop an accession treaty even when it's negotiated. The lowest level in 2013, I have looked at data up to 2016. There's quite a bit of variation by member state and candidate. Turkey is the most problematic candidate, but even if we don't think about it, there is still a big gap in public support for enlargement. So you can see how this has been moving. The forward trend has been moving downwards, and against trend, about half of EU citizens on average in 2016 were against enlargement. And this is problematic because, again, far-right parties in a number of EU member states are mobilizing the public and using this in electoral campaigns, whereas major parties do not particularly defend or promote enlargement. So let's skip that Macedonia and Serbia for a moment and see whether citizens have actually different ideas on enlargement. And we investigated this in this broad project, which included older EU member states, newer EU member states, Bulgaria and Poland, and 2 candidate states, North Macedonia and Serbia. We investigated these discourses by defining them as stories or narratives consisting, in our case, methodologically of clusters of statements. Stories or narratives about enlargement as experienced by people, as expressed in people's own language. What I'll show you in a moment are unedited statements, which have been just translated. And we followed in this the work by John Dryzek, who has argued for a long time that citizens have their own narratives, their own discourses that help them make sense of political phenomena. And discourses in this case mean nothing else than the shared means of making sense of the world, coherent stories containing both opinions of facts, but also values, dispositions, and emotional responses. So please note that this definition of discourses is important because what we looked at is not necessarily whether citizens know what enlargement entails. We wanted to know more what it entails for them. And of course, we can say there's many things that citizens don't understand about the EU acquis, about enlargement, about the reforms and adaptation, but citizens in the region are voters, their opinion matters, as I tried to show you in this introductory part, and so does matter the opinion of citizens in the older EU member states. Very briefly, we did this through a methodology which is developed in psychology, and its purpose is to capture intersubjectivity, or how people talk between each other on specific topics. We used the various steps of Q methodology identified here on this particular slide. You don't need to be worried about those steps, but if you have questions, I can explain later. But what this methodology means, is one thing which I want you to understand and remember, is that it doesn't actually involve much of the judgment of the researchers. I mean, we have many judgments, opinions. I've studied enlargement for quite a while, as have my colleagues who participated in this. And we thought, well, let's use a method which actually eliminates all this and aggregates simply what is on the ground, the discourses on the ground, which in fact are factors based on our final factor analysis of a number of statements involving a number of respondents. Now, the big research included 6 countries, and it took place in 2013, 2014. It's getting a little bit outdated, but discourses, stories actually are less outdated than public opinion, interestingly enough, and I can explain to you later why this is. There were a number of locations, a number of statements. As I said, they were not edited. Statements were selected using a matrix for political analysis. There were different set of respondents who scored those selected statements in different locations, which involved, as you can see, in Serbia, they're a little bit clustered, but in North Macedonia, they're all over the country and involved also a number of locations in the other EU member states, as you can see. And this is, let me first show you, this is our landscape of discourses, landscape of stories, which means discourses around which a number of our respondents clustered, which were stories meaningful to them based on their statements and interviews. The full landscape is here. What it means, I'll tell you in a moment. Why the countries have, some of them have 4 discourses, some of them have 3. This has to do with the factor analysis and how many different clusters of statements were identified. So in some countries, there's more stories about the same thing, enlargement. Others, the older member states I might show you later, depending on how we're doing on time. Bulgaria and Poland are also interesting, but here our focus are Serbia and North Macedonia, where in both cases we have, in 2014, 4 different discourses. Let's have a look at what these discourses actually do, what they are, and what they're about. And starting with Serbia, our perhaps most credible candidate for enlargement. And the first discourse, and let me just tell you that they are numbered based on approximately number of respondents subscribing to them, but these are not public opinion. These are not public opinion survey in the sense that these discourses are numbered according to strength in our sample, but they're not necessarily representative of how strong they're in the populations. Could be in the total population of Serbia, it could be, let's say, discourse number 4 is stronger, or discourse number 3, or discourse number 2. So please bear this in mind. I'm presenting them now based on how they appear in our sample, but Q methodology is not one that is working with this kind of representativity that we can say number 1 is the biggest. So anyway, our first discourse, around which a number of respondents clustered, and it consists of a number of statements, here I'm showing the most important ones, was called cautiously positive expectations. So let me say the labels we have given to the discourses based on interpreting the most important statements. When I'm showing you things in inverted commas, this is directly as it has been said by respondents and edited minimally for logic in English. So here you see cautiously positive expectations, better for young people to be in the European Union. I'll show you a little bit more of the statements of this discourse later. The second discourse in Serbia shows a different landscape. In Serbia, a very strong discourse on mistrust and hostility, where Kosovo is very important, where specific hostility towards the EU was expressed. Then the third discourse is a little bit more positive than the second, but it is focusing on the conditions. What will the EU change in Serbia? Very interesting here, Rakia is coming. This is, of course, a translation for English, but probably the original word was for brandy was Rakia. I'll show you a little bit more about this later. And the fourth discourse mentions something which is mentioned practically in every single discourse on enlargement across the region and also further, EU rules. The advantage of the European Union is that authority and powers in institutions are not in people. Let's have a look at what all this means. What did people talk about in the first discourse? Here are 3 of our so-called distinguishing statements, which gives you an idea. Our groups of respondents subscribe to these statements very strongly. So the first one focuses on young people should be in the European Union, window to the world, out of poverty, still important for Serbia. The second one, life to be better for my children. You can see the economic rationale is quite important, education, employment, income. The third one mentions, the third statement from the same discourse mentions human rights and freedoms, freedom of movement, ideas, and independent judiciary and police. So here we're beginning to see that those who are positive towards enlargement have positive expectations. In Serbia, they also think about institutions, they think about economics, but they also think about institutions. So that's our first discourse in Serbia. And the second discourse, mistrust and hostility, is grouping people who think about the EU and potential accession completely differently. First one, it's like we're not going to gain anything. Underdeveloped country means, in this case, for example, other countries in the EU, Bulgaria, potentially, neighbor, nobody's better off from joining the EU. The second statement says conditions are imposed on Serbia that were not applied for other countries. What about Kosovo? There may be even more pressure. The third one, the EU doesn't need such a country as Serbia. The fourth one, the EU will destroy everything which Serbia has. By the way, these are separate statements from separate people. I've just put the inverted commas, didn't have time to put them on every single statement. So you can see mistrust and hostility, very important discourse in Serbia, as we know, also on the government level. This is something which also lives among the citizens. Number three, nuance, but also some skepticism. The first one, we cannot make our own brandy here in Serbia or rakia or whatever it is that they wanted to brew. Factually not correct, but an important consideration, which reminds me to tell you that very similar concerns existed in Hungary about Palinka when Hungary started negotiating to be joining the European Union. Then another statement, we would like to export our own products, don't have to pay customs duties. This is the single market, why actually Serbian businesses can benefit from joining the EU. Then work, again, the economic rationale, and infrastructure, the last statement here, which is also very interesting because in a way, this is what the EU's new initiative is about. A couple of those economic and infrastructure projects might actually help some of those citizens who feel that this is it, business, tariffs, infrastructure, connectivity. And the last one, focusing on EU rules, institutions, it is the smallest discourse in our sample. It might be also smallest in whole Serbia, but it exists. And it's talking about authority and power in the institutions and not in individuals. And it's also talking about enlargement being a voluntary process and the EU being a community of free will and a community of rules. So you can see that the way that people make sense of their expectations of what enlargement might do for Serbia or not do is quite complex. There are 4 different ways, 4 different narratives next to smaller ones in Serbia. What about North Macedonia? Here we start, also 4 discourses. Here we start with EU as better governance. And immediately we're seeing that this idea that the European Union is leading to Europeanization of institutions lives among the citizens. The first one is that North Macedonia has to have a functioning state. This is a very skeptical statement saying, well, at the moment we don't have it. The second one shows a realization that not all problems are going to be fixed by the EU, something, by the way, which didn't exist in Bulgaria when Bulgaria joined, understanding, perhaps because of the longer period of North Macedonia's candidacy, that problems still are governmental problems for reform and governance. Third one, very interesting, we're not ready to join the EU. Macedonia, North Macedonian statements has a lot of this lack of readiness. And please note that this was under not the government led by Zoran Zaev, but this was under government of Vemiro Diplomat. Then we have a statement which shows very much a social side of accession. The EU has a social model which North Macedonia doesn't use at the moment. That's what the EU is for. It will make us observe the rules. Again, rules are actually more important to citizens than their governments would give them credit for, is what we notice from this. There's a second discourse from North Macedonia, which, as one of the Serbian ones, focuses on the importance of business, of trade, of lack of tariffs. The EU makes it easier for business and politics. Barriers are removed, employment, imports and exports. And then again, the laws and the rules. We may have laws, but they're not observed, somebody says. On the other one hand, we want the EU. On the other, we think, who cares? Meaning we are not observing the rules and hope to keep the status quo. Then you have another discourse which says Macedonia is not ready, which is aiming to change issues like corruption. But politicians and citizens are of a different mind, as you can see from the second statement. Politicians tell us we are ready, but maybe we are not. Requirements we have to meet. And then the last one is also about preparation, very similar discourse, but different group of respondents, where there's a bit of an ethnic difference between Slavic North Macedonians and Albanians. Both of those discourses, this one and this one, talk about lack of preparation. Notice the first statement. Again, this was before the change of the name. I honestly think the government doesn't want us to join the EU because then all loans and credits would be controlled, and it's obvious that they take advantage of the situation with the name issue. And also putting first your affairs in order, creating up an institutional system is something which the countries find the citizens find very, very important. People in the EU are not stupid, they know what we are. We give us the chance to get ready. So as you can see, in North Macedonia, there's a lot of discourses on preparation, on actually getting the country ready in order to move on further. But we started with the story of citizens both in candidate states and in the EU need to be prepared to accept enlargement. So we've seen that in North Macedonia and Serbia, there's quite a varied landscape, but there is certainly more understanding that enlargement accession involves rules and adaptation than perhaps governments give the citizens credit for. Are there similarities to this in the countries that we looked at in the older EU member states, that citizens understand what enlargement is about? Because then we have a bridge to build on. Are they bridging discourses or are they cleavages? Is the next question. I'll give you a very quick, not such a detailed, fleeting look at discourses in North Macedonia, in the Netherlands and Germany, very quickly. In the Netherlands, you see that there is a group of citizens that subscribe to enlargement as a fulfillment of their ideals. This we haven't heard from any political party in the Netherlands, but it exists among the citizens. Again, unfortunately, this may not be the majority of public opinion, but there are certainly people who say we shouldn't be looking only at money and wealth when enlargement. We should have the EU as something with ideals and values. Then you have very familiar utilitarian rejection discourse where citizens are saying we were never asked in the Netherlands. It was pushed down from above to down our throats. We lost jobs, and it does have to do with enlargement. This has to do with, of course, how Eastern enlargement has affected the labor market in the Netherlands, especially after 2014. And then the third discourse is very typical across the EU. This is get your house in order in the EU before you enlarge. We need deepening, and before widening, let's give the EU a new meaning, and so on and so forth. So this is the Dutch discourse landscape. Then we look very briefly at Germany, where we have 4 different stories, 4 different narratives. The first one is skeptical, which says, if we look at it closer, maybe not everyone is happy being in the EU. We have too little information how enlargement has affected the countries that joined the EU. The second one is very democratic oriented, and we're saying, let's add the economic connections. Let's increase the size of the EU economy, but let's also consider cultural diversity to be preserved. And the third discourse says we should have more gradual integration. That's again a deepening before widening story. We need to take care of the EU's internal affairs, very common. And the fourth discourse in Germany is also very interesting, which says enlargement will help to realize Europe's global potential. So as you can see, the landscape is also quite problematic in terms of agreement with enlargement. In Germany, especially if we consider the first discourse, is highly Eurosceptical. As a last step, before we move towards our discussion, these discourses across the different countries, I didn't show you Bulgaria and Poland, they can be grouped to see what the bigger connections, the bigger cleavages and connections are. So the divisions, they can be grouped based on basic arguments. Here I'm showing you one example of this grouping. Every country, almost every country in the EU has a rule-based community discourse. In Bulgaria, this is striving for union rules and values. In Germany, rules-driven enlargement. In the Netherlands, deepening before widening. Serbia, the first discourse that I showed you, cautiously positive expectations. And in North Macedonia, the European rules and standards discourse. If we look at the arguments that connect across countries before we make a final stop to say, what does this all mean? We see that the EU as a rule-based community is a very strong connecting discourse for citizens across the EU. Using common rules and standards, as well as explicit rules for membership, is an important way in which citizens understand the EU. Seeing the Union as a source of better governance is stronger in the East than in the West, but it's certainly an understanding of the necessity to have responsive domestic institutions that is common for citizens in candidate states and in the new member states. There is also the story of the US shared ideals and values, which is, again, existed as a shared story across the EU, in which solidarity, diversity, and peace are seen as main European values. But there is also the utilitarian outlook, where citizens in the East are looking for jobs and improvement in their economic situation. Businesses in the East, Southeast as well, looking for less tariffs and being part of the internal market, roads and connectivity, personal material well-being, jobs for the children, future. And citizens in the older member states are looking for the same thing, but then they're blaming the previous enlargement for actually creating a problem with jobs. Then we have this very unique discourse, mostly in Germany, of the EU that would be a global actor. You see that Germany is the biggest country in our set. It certainly makes a difference. Then we have strong undercurrents of skepticism in the older EU member states, but also disappointment that things are not leading to true reform in the southeast of Europe, but also in the new member states. And then you have the group of citizens that are rejecting enlargement, but also the EU in general. So you can see that there are common ideas and narratives across the EU in the East and West on enlargement. Some of them approve of it, some of them don't. What does it mean? I'm going to give you partial conclusions so that we can open our discussion further. If we talk about EU enlargement, we often talk about top-down, we talk about chapters as we started, we talk about conditionality, leading or not to reforms in Europeanization. Norm diffusion is often criticized as being weak. You have a number of lectures coming that might be talking about the same thing. And usually we mean the norms as they are spread by governments as they are implemented. But judging by what citizens had to say about enlargement in 2014, norm diffusion in Europeanization is actually stronger than you would expect. Citizen expectations of reform are quite strong as well. They expect deep institutionalization, they expect true reforms. In this respect, they are very skeptical of their own governments in the region, instead of surface-thin Europeanization. And this clashes, if we look at the developments in the region, which your class is in a perfect position to discuss, this clashes with this emerging strong executive authority, borderline authoritarianism or true authoritarianism, depending on which country you're looking at in the region at government level. So if you look at this contrast, we could come to the provisional conclusion that it is the governments and elites in the region that are the obstacle to enlargement rather than the citizens. And then the way forward, if we actually want more Europeanization, if we want more enlargement of the European Union, is not at the moment pushing the process as hard as it should be. Actually, today is a meeting of foreign ministers, Council of Ministers, Foreign Affairs of the EU, which is dealing with other issues, dealing with Russia, with Ukraine, COVID, and the meeting with ministers from the Western Balkans has been postponed for May. But what is the way forward, given this particular landscape in the region? I have some answers, but I think it would be actually better to now start the discussion. So I'm going to round off here and leave you to your questions and comments.
Great, Antoaneta, thank you very much for this very good also juxtaposition of discourses in the European Union, or some EU member states, and in the region, and in a certain way kind of trying to create these clusters of how to understand them. So thanks a lot.